A young man sits on a cot in a basement. He is not a criminal. He has broken no law. 6 days ago, he answered a newspaper ad for $15 a day. Right now, he is pounding on a locked door and begging to be released. And the men who will not open that door were chosen to hold him by the flip of a coin. They are students, like him. Ordinary. Kind, most of them, in every other room of their lives. In 36 hours, something inside him appears to break. For half a century, the world was told that basement showed us the truth about human nature, that anyone in the wrong room becomes a monster. It showed us something. It just wasn't that. Because the man who built that basement was running a second experiment, one he never listed on any form, and the real subject of it was standing at the front of the room, holding a clipboard, calling himself the Superintendent. The study is the Stanford Prison Experiment, August 1971. A psychology professor named Philip Zimbardo takes 24 young men, splits them at random into prisoners and guards, and locks them in a fake jail built into the basement of the Stanford Psychology Department. It is supposed to run for 2 weeks. It is called off after 6 days. You already know the headline. Good people put in a bad place turned cruel. It became the most famous psychology study of the 20th century. It's in every textbook. It shaped how courts think about abuse, how the public thinks about prisons, how you think about yourself. Here is what almost no one was told for 40 years. The guards did not simply become cruel on their own. They were coached. A member of the research staff sat them down before it began and told them, in effect, to be tough. The rules that broke the prisoners were not invented by the guards in the heat of the moment. They were handed to them. And the conclusion the study is famous for was written, in Zimbardo's own notes, largely before the first cell door ever closed. So this episode is not going to ask the question you expect. It is not going to ask whether good people turn evil. That question has an answer, and it is more interesting than yes. The question is this. If the guards were directed, if the most famous breakdown was partly performed, if the ending was scripted before it began, then why does the mechanism this study claimed to find keep turning out to be real? How can an experiment be staged and correct at the same time? There are 5 mechanisms operating in that basement. I am going to name all 5. The first 4 explain the 24 young men. The 5th one explains the man who was studying them. And the 5th is the one that matters, because it is the one still running today, in rooms with no cameras and no coin flip, on people who are certain it could never be them. We start where they started, with a coin. To understand what happened, you have to understand how carefully it was built to happen. This was not a shoestring operation. The study was funded by the U.S. Office of Naval Research. The Navy and the Marine Corps wanted to understand conflict between guards and prisoners in military detention. So, there was a client, there was a budget, and there was a professor with a hypothesis he already believed and now needed to demonstrate. The volunteers answered an ad in the Palo Alto papers. Zimbardo screened them for stability and picked the ones who tested most normal. That detail is doing a lot of quiet work. It lets you say, later, these were not damaged men. These were the healthy ones. Whatever happened to them could happen to you. Then the coin. Prisoner or guard, decided by chance, so that the only difference between the 2 groups was the role. No personality, no history, nothing but the label. And then the design went to work on the label. The prisoners were arrested at their homes by real Palo Alto police as a favor to Zimbardo. Booked, fingerprinted, blindfolded, brought to the basement, stripped, deloused, and put in a smock with no underwear and a number stitched on it. They were told they would be called by that number, not their name, their number. A stocking cap on the head to erase the hair, a chain on one ankle. Every single one of those choices removes a piece of the person. This is the first mechanism, and it has a name, Deindividuation. The term comes from social psychologists in the 1950s, and Zimbardo himself spent years developing it. The definition is simple and cold. Deindividuation is the psychological state in which a person loses their sense of individual identity, and with it, their normal internal breaks. When you cannot be seen as yourself, when you are a number in a uniform in a crowd, the private voice that says, "I don't do this," goes quiet. You have felt a weak version of it. The car horn you lean on in traffic that you would never sound if the other driver could see your face. The comment you'd type behind a screen name and never say across a table. Anonymity loosens something. That is deindividuation at low dose. And Zimbardo had already measured the high dose 2 years earlier in a study most people have never heard of. In 1969, he ran an experiment where women were asked to deliver electric shocks to another person. Half of them wore their own clothes and a name tag, fully identifiable. The other half were dressed in hoods and loose coats that hid their faces, made anonymous. The hooded women delivered shocks for twice as long. Same people, same task. The only thing that changed was whether they could be seen. Take away the face, and the cruelty roughly doubled. So when Zimbardo built the prison, he was not guessing. He was assembling a machine out of a variable he already knew how to pull. The basement was deindividuation applied to both sides at once. The prisoners lost their names. And the guards, this is the part people forget, were deindividuated too. Khaki uniforms, silver reflective sunglasses, so no prisoner could ever see their eyes. A whistle, a club. The guards were made just as anonymous as the men they controlled. 2 groups of strangers, stripped of their faces, handed a script about who had power over whom. Now, here is the science, and here is the first crack in the myth. For 50 years, the story was that deindividuation plus the situation was enough. Put anyone in that uniform and the cruelty follows automatically, like water running downhill. That is the version in the textbook. But the guards did not all turn cruel. Some were strict. Some were fair. Some quietly did favors for the prisoners when no one was watching. Only about a third became genuinely abusive. If the situation alone flipped a switch in every human being, you would not see thirds. You would see everyone. So the situation was not pulling the trigger by itself. Something was aiming it. And that brings us to a man with a theater background, a paid consultant who spent 17 years in prison, and a set of tapes that sat in a box for 40 years. In 2018, a writer named Ben Blum published an investigation. In 2019, a French researcher named Thibault Letexier published a paper in the journal American Psychologist, built from the study's own archives, which Zimbardo's team had finally opened to scholars. The recordings, the memos, the planning notes, everything. What was on them reframes the whole study. Start with the most abusive guard, the one the prisoners nicknamed John Wayne. His real name is Dave Eshelman. He was not a natural sadist discovering his dark side. He was a college student with a background in acting, and he later said plainly that he treated the whole thing as improvisation. He built a cruel character on purpose. He borrowed a southern accent from a movie. He pushed to see how far the experiment would let him go, because he believed that was what the researchers wanted. He believed he was being helpful. He was right. That is the part that should unsettle you. He was not misreading the room, because on the tapes you can hear the staff coaching. The warden, a young man named David Jaffe, tells the guards they need to be tougher, that the prisoners are too relaxed, that a real prison would not look like this. The guards are not left alone to discover cruelty. They are being steered toward it, corrected when they drift soft, encouraged when they escalate. And the cruelty had a source outside the guards entirely. Zimbardo hired a consultant named Carlo Prescott, a man who had spent 17 years inside San Quentin. Prescott described the real humiliations of prison life, the tactics guards used to break a man, and many of those specific tactics then appeared in the basement. Years later, Prescott put his name to an essay with a blunt title. He called the study "A Lie." He said the abuse the world treated as a spontaneous discovery about human nature had, in large part, been described to the guards in advance, handed to them as a menu. So the cruelty did not well up from inside 24 normal men. It was sourced, scripted, and requested. This is the second mechanism, and it is the one that quietly dismantles the study, while also being the reason the study still teaches us something true. Its name is demand characteristics. The term comes from a psychologist named Martin Orne, who described it in 1962, almost a decade before Stanford. The definition is this: demand characteristics are the cues in a situation that tell a participant what is expected of them, so that, wanting to be a good subject, they deliver it. People in experiments are not blank slates waiting to react. They are reading the room, constantly, asking a silent question. What does the person running this want from me? And then, most of them helpfully provide it. Orne showed how far this goes with a task designed to be unbearable. He handed people stacks of paper covered in rows of random numbers and told them to add each adjacent pair, then, when they finished a sheet, to tear it into pieces and start the next one. Meaningless work, destroyed the moment it was done. He expected people to quit in minutes. They did it for hours. Some kept going until he stopped them. Why? Because the situation implied it mattered. The experiment demanded persistence, so they supplied persistence and invented their own private reasons for it afterward. Now put that into the basement. You have young men who volunteered for something openly called a prison study. They are being paid. They can read, from every cue in the room, what a successful outcome looks like. And then, in case they somehow miss it, the staff tells them directly, and a former convict has already shown them how. Be tough. Make it real. The guards were not revealing what humans secretly are. They were performing what the authority in the room had shown them they were there to do. That is not evil rising out of the situation. That is compliance dressed in a uniform. Which means the famous conclusion is contaminated. You cannot claim the cruelty was spontaneous when you are on tape requesting it, and when you paid a man to describe it first. But watch what happens when you try to throw the whole study away. You reach for the reason it's wrong, and the reason has a name, and the name is itself a mechanism of obedience. The guards obeyed the researchers. They read what the powerful people in the room wanted, and they became it. Strip out the false lesson about prisons, and underneath it, intact, is a true lesson about how ordinary people bend themselves into the shape that authority signals, and then feel like it was their own idea. The study didn't prove what Zimbardo said. It proved something one layer down, and he was standing on top of that layer the entire time, unable to see it, because he was doing it too. Hold that thought. We are not there yet. The modern version of this mechanism is not a fake prison. It is any workplace where no one is ever ordered to cut the corner, but everyone can read, from the numbers that get praised and the people who get promoted, exactly what the corner is and exactly when to cut it. Nobody signs anything. Nobody has to. The room makes the demand. The people supply it. And afterward, every one of them says the same sentence the guards said. I don't know. I just got caught up in it. They didn't get caught up in it. They read it. And they gave it what it asked for. Here is a question that should bother you. If the archives existed the whole time, if the coaching was on tape, why did it take almost 50 years for anyone to say this out loud? Why did the world believe the clean version for 2 full generations? The answer is the third mechanism, and this one is not operating on the guards. It's operating on the audience, on all of us. Its name is the fundamental attribution error. The definition from the psychologist Lee Ross in 1977. When we explain other people's behavior, we massively overweight their character and underweight their situation. He did it because he's that kind of person. She failed because she's weak. The bad guard was a bad man. We are built to see the person and miss the pressure. It is the default setting of human judgment, and it runs so quietly you don't feel it running. Now here is the strange twist Zimbardo's study performed on that error, because this is where he was genuinely, historically clever. His entire pitch was the opposite of the attribution error. He said, "Stop blaming character, look at the situation. the barrel spoils the apples. That message was liberating. It felt humane. It told a nation that the abuser, the collaborator, the ordinary participant in something terrible might not be a rotten individual but a normal person in a rotten structure. He carried that argument all the way into a courtroom. When the photographs came out of Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, American soldiers abusing detainees, Zimbardo served as an expert witness for the defense of one of the guards. His testimony was, in essence, "Look at Stanford. The situation does this. Don't only blame the man." The theory had become a legal argument for diminished responsibility, used to explain real abuse of real prisoners 3 decades later. People wanted that theory to be true, so they didn't check it. And that is the mechanism operating on the audience. We accepted a story about situations precisely because it flattered our sense that we, personally, are not the problem. If it's the situation, then I'm off the hook. The clean version of Stanford let millions of people believe they were good people who happened to be lucky about their rooms. Nobody audits a conclusion that comforts them. The irony is exact. A study about how we misjudge behavior survived for decades because its audience misjudged the study. Now the fourth mechanism, and this is where it connects to something we've studied before on this channel. Watch the guards again, but this time, watch their language. When they were interviewed afterward, the abusive ones almost never said, "I decided to hurt him." They said versions of, "That was my job. We were told to run it like a prison. I was playing the role." They described themselves as instruments, as if the choices belonged to someone above them, and they were simply the hands. Stanley Milgram had a name for this state. He called it the agentic state. The definition: a psychological condition in which a person stops seeing themselves as the author of their own actions and starts seeing themselves as an agent carrying out the wishes of an authority. In the agentic state, you don't feel responsible because, in your own mind, you didn't decide. You were told. Milgram found it a few years before Stanford, in the study this channel opened with. He had ordinary people deliver what they believed were escalating electric shocks to a stranger, all the way to a switch marked 450 volts, because a man in a lab coat calmly said, "Continue." 65% of them went all the way to the end. Not because they were cruel, because they had handed the wheel to the authority and stopped feeling like the driver. The Stanford guards are the same mechanism wearing a different costume. The authority said, "Run a prison," and they passed their conscience up the chain to the man with the clipboard. But there is a newer, sharper reading of this, and it comes from 2 psychologists, Alex Haslam and Stephen Reicher, who ran their own prison study for the BBC in 2002 and got a very different result. In their version, the guards did not automatically absorb the role at all. Some refused to be harsh. The prisoners organized. For a while, the prisoners actually won, and the guard structure collapsed, which is the opposite of what Stanford predicts. The system only tipped toward cruelty later, and only when leadership gave the cruelty a cause, a purpose, a reason that made being hard feel like being righteous. They called it engaged followership. The idea is that people do not commit institutional cruelty as mindless robots in a trance. They do it as believers. They do it when a leader convinces them that being hard is being good, that the harshness serves a mission worth serving. The guard is not a puppet with the strings cut. The guard is a volunteer for a cause somebody above him defined. Hold those 2 readings side by side, because the truth of Stanford lives somewhere between them. Milgram's agentic state, where the follower goes numb and obeys, and engaged followership, where the follower wakes up and believes. They sound like opposites. They require the exact same thing. A leader above them supplying the purpose and the permission. Which forces the question we have been circling since the first minute. Every mechanism so far ends in the same place. Each one points up at the person in charge. So, who was in charge? And what this whole time was happening to him? Philip Zimbardo did not watch the Stanford Prison Experiment. That is the thing to understand. He was not behind glass with a notebook. He gave himself a role inside his own study. He called himself the prison superintendent. Sit with what that means. The scientist, whose entire job is to stand outside the situation and observe it cleanly, climbed inside the situation and took the most powerful role in it. He was, at the same moment, the man measuring the cruelty and the man running the prison the cruelty happened in. The instrument and the operator fused into one person who could no longer tell which one he was. And the fifth mechanism took him exactly the way it took everyone else. Its name is role absorption. The definition: when a role comes with clear expectations, real status, and a costume, a person can be pulled into acting as the role demands rather than as themselves, until the priorities of the role quietly replace their own. Here is how you know it took him. On the fifth night, a young graduate student named Christina Maslock came down to the basement to see the study. She was not a subject. She had no role. She was also, at the time, someone Zimbardo was dating. She watched the guards march a line of chained, bagged prisoners to the toilet, and she watched the man she knew treat it as fascinating data. And she was horrified. She told him directly that what he was doing to those boys was terrible, and that if this was who he became in here, she was not sure she knew him, and the scientist did not thank her for the observation. The superintendent got defensive. He argued back. For a moment, the man who had built an entire experiment to prove that situations corrupt good people could not see the situation corrupting him, in real time, in his own basement. It took an outsider, someone standing in no role at all, to break the spell. He said, later, that her reaction was what made him realize he had to end the study the next morning, which is another way of admitting that he had stopped being the scientist, and that someone had to walk in from the real world and remind him he was a person. He married her the following year. The one participant who stayed fully human in that basement was the one who was never assigned a part. Now put the whole picture together, because this is the reveal we opened with. The guards were coached to be cruel by the staff. The staff were serving the vision of the superintendent. The tactics were fed in by a consultant. The superintendent was Zimbardo. And Zimbardo had already written the conclusion he wanted before any of it started. And then he stepped inside his own machine and, without ever noticing, spent 6 days producing that conclusion, defending it, and absorbing the precise role he was there to study. The clean story says the Stanford Prison Experiment proved that a situation can turn a normal person into someone who does harm and calls it duty. It did prove that. It just proved it about the wrong man. The most complete case of a decent person absorbed by a role, blinded by it, made unable to see the harm directly in front of him, was not any guard in reflective sunglasses. It was the psychologist who designed the entire machine to catch that mechanism in other people, then walked into the frame and performed it himself, on tape, and did not know. That is why the study can be staged and still be right. Zimbardo shaped the evidence for his theory, and in the act of shaping it, he became the truest example of the theory the experiment ever produced. The mechanism was real. It was just running one level higher than anyone was looking, and it kept running for 50 years. He spent the rest of his life defending the study, writing the book, giving the talks, consulting on the movie, insisting the cruelty had been spontaneous while his own archived tapes said otherwise. Half a century inside the role of the man who discovered the dark truth about human nature, so deep in that role he could never once turn the lens around and see it closing over him. So let's name them, all 5. Deindividuation, which stripped the names and faces off both sides and quieted the private voice that says, "I don't do this." Demand characteristics, the cues, the consultant, and the direct coaching that told the guards what a good subject delivers, so they delivered it and believed it was their own idea. The fundamental attribution error, which kept an entire public from checking the story for 50 years, because a story about bad situations is more comfortable than a story about people like us. the agentic state and engaged followership, the two ways a person hands their conscience upward, either going numb and obeying or waking up and believing, both of them needing a leader above them to supply the purpose, and role absorption, which took the guards and took the staff and finally took the scientist himself, the one man in the room who was certain he was immune. None of these mechanisms needs abasement. None of them needs a coin flip or a costume, though the costume helps. They need only a role with clear expectations, an authority who signals what winning looks like, and a person who wants, as almost everyone does, to be a good subject. You will never meet a prison superintendent. You will meet the quiet version, a room where no one orders the cruelty but everyone can read the reward for it. A leader who never says be harsh, only says be committed, and lets you fill in the rest. A conclusion you accept without checking because it lets you off the hook. A role you step into so smoothly that you never feel the moment your own judgment left the building. The Stanford Prison Experiment did not show us that we are monsters waiting for a bad room. It showed us something quieter and harder to escape. That the person most certain the mechanism could never take him is usually the one already inside it, holding the clipboard, calling it his job. The mechanisms we've studied today have names, and they are operating right now in the world around you. Most of all in the rooms that are certain they are the exception.